Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started here at Mathews Company. My name is Joe Scholfer. I'm the president of Mathews Company. With us here in Crystal Lake is Mike Wilkie. He's our director of operations and engineering. We have Eric Calder, co-developer of Pinnacle 2020 and our engineering team lead. And we have Nick Nanos, our director of product sales and marketing. Before we jump into the content, we just want to go over a couple things. For the dealers that are on the line, all of you that have Pinnacle 2020 dryers that have shipped prior to last week would have gotten a package in the mail for a Pinnacle 2020 software update kit. And we want to make sure that you know if your dryers out there need to be updated with this software. So if you're following along on the screen, I'm going to go ahead and have Eric pull up one screenshot of the software, and we're going to get into this quite in depth here as we go through the software today. But when you're navigating through the Pinnacle 2020 software, Eric's going to show us where you can go to the system config screen, and right there in the middle you're going to see the PLC version number, and right next to it you're going to see the HMI version number. Those versions that are up there correspond to the ones that were sent out in all of the correspondence. What you want to be looking for is that those last two digits are .00. That means that you have the latest update for your software, and you are going to want to make sure you have that. It's absolutely important that you have that latest version of your software updated before dryer operations commence this fall. Another important announcement that we want to make is the manuals for all dryers for 2017 are now loaded on our website. They are on the public side of the Mathews Company website. And Eric just has up here right now the 10-foot towers. You can see we have the operations manual, and then right underneath it is a Pinnacle 2020 control manual. So if you don't have a copy of that, and you will because we sent those all out with the software updates, but if you ever need to refer to it, they're all on our website. They're not on the dealer gateway side, they're on the public side for the controls manual and the operations manual. So be sure to check those out as well. We want to take a quick minute just to thank everybody for joining us on the call today. We had in the neighborhood of 50 or 60 people register for this webinar. We here at Mathews Company are really thrilled with the rollout of this new product. This has been in development for close to 2 years now, and this is the first year that we have this in large quantity of operation. We're very confident in the development work we've done so far. We've done extensive amounts of testing, and the final piece in our mind is to provide our dealers and our end users with the best possible training so that you guys have spectacular experience using this control system. One thing to note, we're going to be doing a lot of interactive operation of the Pinnacle 2020 control system here on your computer screens today. Obviously, the Pinnacle 2020 is a dual screen system. Anything you can do on the left-hand side, you can do on the right-hand side. That's part of the design of the system. You can have multiple screens loaded, so you can look at the control of the dryer on one side, you can look at the overview screen on the other. What we're going to be showing on the screen here today is just going to be a single screen, so just keep that in mind just for the sake of simplicity of this demonstration, this training session here today. We're going to be only using one screen. Just one last final reminder before I turn it over to Eric. If we could just, if it's possible with the device you're using, if you could mute the audio until later on when we take questions, just to try to keep it as quiet as possible to provide the best listening experience for everyone, that would be greatly appreciated. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric, and we're going to go ahead and get started.
All right, thank you, Joe. And Joe mentioned my name's Eric. I've been working on the software from the beginning, developing this. So we're quite excited to be releasing it and get to see your guys' reactions and get feedback. To start, just again, a couple reminders. If you can please mute your phone until later. There will be an opportunity to ask questions later, at which point we can definitely turn those phones back on. But for now, if we can try to keep the line nice and quiet. And with that in mind, if we can also save our questions till the end. So as we're going through, if anything comes up that's confusing that you'd like to refer back to later, just go ahead and write it down, and we'll have an opportunity to answer as many of those questions as we can at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, let's get started. There's a few key topics that we sent out that we'd like to cover during this presentation. But before I get started, I want to show just a quick overview of the software for people who maybe aren't so familiar yet. So I'm going to be going back and forth throughout the presentation between a PowerPoint, which you see here, and we also have this simulation, so I can show you the screens. This is attached to a demo legacy L1000 dryer that we have. So it doesn't work exactly the same as a live dryer, but it's pretty close, so we can get a lot of good simulation out of this. So this screen we see here is our home screen. Basically, you can get to any part of the software from this screen. See, on the top we have some information about your dryer. The middle here we have our three main pages, our control, overview, and monitor. You'll notice that these have blue triangles on the corner. Anywhere that you see that shade of blue, either in a triangle or in a blue button like this, that indicates a button that'll navigate you to another page. So for instance, if I click on the control button, it'll take me to the control page. On this page, a couple notes we want to look at. There's a few different styles of input fields. You see here an input field with green numbers and a dark background. That's a display field. These numbers cannot be adjusted. Whereas anywhere that you see a white background with a black number, these are input fields. If I were to click on this, I'll have an entry pad where I can put in a new number. So throughout the software, you'll be seeing data fields like that. You'll be seeing quick launch buttons like the ones here indicated by these blue triangles. If I were to click on one of these quick launch buttons, it'll take me to a page that has more information about that area. And also you'll be seeing these question marks throughout the software. We've placed these question marks anywhere that we think more information could help the user. So if you're looking at this portion of the software and you've got questions about how to work it, you can click on this question mark and a helpful window will come up that gives you a description of what each part of that block does, how to change it, and just in general how it works. So we've tried to take information and put it at your fingertips and try to help you along in running the dryer. So with that, I want to jump back to our first topic. Today we're going to talk about setting your operational and alarm set points. We're going to go through a dryer startup and talk about first fill and how that works. We'll be looking at a dryer shutdown, both when you shut it down or when it shuts down due to an alarm condition. We'll look a little bit at basic troubleshooting and what tools have been put into the software to aid with that. And we'll also take a quick look at entering the automatic modes of operation, TrueDry and AccuDry. So the first piece we want to look at is how to set alarm set points. Put a little diagram together here. You'll see a similar setup throughout the software for a lot of the alarm set points. The way that we've organized this is with the actual value in the middle. That's going to be displayed with the green text. And then above and below it, you'll have several different alarms associated with that value. So we've organized it this way so that you can see that there's a warning alarm above your value and a critical alarm above your value, as well as a warning and critical alarm below that value. So the way that these are set up, if your value goes above your warning limit, you'll get a yellow warning alarm that won't shut you down. If you go above your red critical alarm limit, you will get an alarm that will shut down the dryer. So you'll be seeing this setup in many places throughout the software. We can jump over to the simulation here. The reason, by the way, I'm starting with alarm operational set points is you're going to want to check a lot of these settings before you get started for the first day. You'll want to make sure that from the factory that the values that we've entered are applicable to what you're trying to do. So we're going to take a look. I'm going to go to my System Settings tab. So by clicking on these three buttons on the bottom, it brings up a different set of navigational buttons. If I go to System Settings and then Discharge Speed Control, I can see here everything that pertains to discharge. I've got some operational set points up here. I've got alarm settings over here. These are just general information so that you can understand how your dryer is running. So you can see we've put several different portions of the software onto one page. These operational set points, it's important to understand the difference between an operational set point and an alarm set point. These values are hard-coded and you cannot run outside of these values. So if I were to try to change my speed outside of this range from 20 to 95, we'll see that my minimum value I can enter is 20 and my maximum value I can enter is 95. If I were to reduce my minimum speed to 15, now when I go to change my discharge speed, I can go from 15 to 95. So where you see something like this, an operational set point, these are hard-coded, it's going to restrict what the dryer can run at. That's different from an alarm setting. So an alarm setting is going to trigger an alarm but continue trying to operate the dryer. If we're running at a current speed, right now the dryer is not running, so we're at 0. But if we were running at 22% like our set point is, and then we went up above 93.3%, we'd get a warning alarm, a yellow warning alarm. If we continued to increase speed up above 94.0%, we'd get a cooldown alarm, which would eventually shut us down. And on the low end, we have similar alarms. These alarms have to do with discharge, but they come into several places throughout the software. If we go to our moisture sensor settings, we see a page that looks like this. This page will be slightly different depending on what sensors you have installed on the machine. If your machine is equipped with both in-feed and discharge sensors, you'll see everything we see here. And it looks a little confusing at first, but when you realize that really what we have is 4 blocks like the one we just looked at. We have inlet moisture alarms. All of these are associated together. These 4 white boxes are alarms that are associated with this center value. You can see right now we're not in an alarm condition because 22.4% is between 17.0 and 35.3. We have inlet temperature alarms, outlet moisture alarms, and outlet temperature alarms. A couple notes here. One is that all of these alarm settings are bound by one another. So what I mean by that is that your low warning alarm cannot be lower than your low critical alarm, and it can't be higher than your high warning alarm. So right now my low critical alarm is 15.1. My high warning alarm is 35.3. If I were to change my low warning alarm, I'll see that my minimum is 15.1 and my maximum is 35.3. So if I want to change this value to something lower, let's say 14%, I'll first need to change my critical to something below 14% so that I can now go into my warning alarm and change it down to the 14 that I desired. So it's important to understand how these alarms are all associated together. If you're going to try to change them, you may need to start at the top or bottom and work your way forward. Another comment about these alarms is that you shouldn't feel you shouldn't feel like you have to set every single alarm in a constraining way. So there's several of these alarms that are not going to be important for a certain setup. For instance, your setup may not be concerned with inlet temperature. Most setups aren't going to be. So you have no reason to set these alarm limits too close together. You'll end up having nuisance alarms. But what we've done is we've put all of these alarms in here so that anybody who wants to use them can. And if you're not interested in monitoring a certain value, you can come in here and change your numbers down to very low numbers that you won't expect to see, and you shouldn't experience that alarm. So one of the important things to do prior to starting up is to identify which alarms are important to you and the site that you're working on, and which ones aren't, and set them accordingly. So a few takeaways from this first section is to be aware of the constraints on each of the settings. They might be constrained by absolute minimums and maximums, and they might be constrained by some of the settings around them. Make sure that you set reasonable values for the alarms that matter to you. If you're confused about how to set the values, you can use the layout of the page as a guide. You can also use the question marks that'll be set throughout the software to help describe how to set each value. And importantly, decide which importance need type constraints for your scenario. If there's a setting that you're not concerned about, you can go ahead and set that to wide values and you won't have to worry about it again. So next, we want to take a look at dryer startup, and specifically a new feature that's been added that's going to affect your initial fill of the dryer. So on the center of this page, we can see our home screen. One of the things I want to note is that the pages we show you today are specific to an L1000 dryer. If your dryer is not an L1000, these pages will look a little bit different, but they'll have a lot of similarities. So for instance, on the left-hand side of the screen, we see a control page for a tower dryer. We have control power. You can turn your grain fill and discharge equipment on. You can start your fan and your burners. If you look on the right-hand side of the screen, this is for an L1000, the one that we'll be looking at today. The two pages look different, but if we look around it, we'll see that there's still control power, grain fill and discharge, and 2 plenums for fans and burners. So, especially for people who are running on more than one dryer, it's important to notice that while the screens are going to look slightly different, all the same functions and features will appear on each dryer. It's also important to note, we'll see on the side here, on the right-hand side, we see that 3 and 4, plenums 3 and 4, are grayed out. So what that indicates is that those 2 plenums are not installed on the dryer on this legacy. So taller legacy dryers would have those plenums installed. We're going to take a look now at our simulation here, and we're going to walk through a startup process, a regular startup. I'm going to go to my control page. When you first arrive at your dryer and you have control power turned on, assuming you don't have any alarms, which we'll get into some alarms later, your control power screen will look like this. You can see several different buttons and several different shades here. So, one of the shades we talked about already was this grayed out button. This indicates a feature that's not installed on the dryer. So all the text is gray. Any fields here will say not available. That indicates that that feature is either not associated with that model dryer or that feature isn't installed on that machine. We can also see buttons like the ones down here that aren't completely gray. They're kind of dimly glowing green and red, but they're not fully illuminated. That tells us that these components are installed on the machine, but they can't currently be turned on for one reason or another. Then we have these buttons up at the top, the control power buttons. They're green and red. They're illuminated green and red, telling you that these buttons are currently ready to be activated. If you look inside the buttons, the text inside the button as well as the color is going to indicate to you exactly what state you're in and what pushing that button will do. So right now we have our control power button. It says turn on, so clicking this button is going to turn on control power. Notice the off button just says off, indicating that you currently don't have control power. If I click the turn on button, it'll try to latch the safety circuit. And then we see this button now is glowing green. There's a green haze around it indicating it's active. And we see that the text inside has changed. So now it just reads on to tell the user that we're currently latched. And the off button now says turn off to indicate that pushing that button will turn off the safety circuit. So I'll turn the safety circuit back on. And something else we should have noticed is that a lot of these other buttons lit up. So that tells me that they're now able to be engaged. They're ready to turn on. A lot of these are all start-stop buttons. And again, the text inside the buttons will change as we click through them. On a normal startup, we will recommend that you turn on control power first, and then we'll ask you to turn your fans on prior to filling the dryer. So we'll go ahead and start fan number 1. We see that when we start fan number 1, the text inside the button changes to say running. We have a green glow around the button. So we're trying to indicate to the user in several different ways exactly what's going on. If we were to toggle over, by the way, we normally would have the overview screen open on the other screen. We'll also get graphics to appear on the screen that would indicate that the fan has in fact turned on the first plenum. We can see that the second plenum is still not running. So we'll go ahead now and start the second plenum. We can see both are running. Notice that we still can't start our burners because we don't have air pressure. You won't get air pressure until the dryer has been filled with grain. At this point, if this was your second or third consecutive startup, you would just click Start Grain Fill. But on your first startup, or anytime you empty the dryer for any reason, before clicking Start, you'll want to come into your grain fill settings, which again, the launch button is located right next to the control buttons. So we'll go into our grain fill settings, and there's a new portion we added here called the Fill from Empty. The reason for this button is that anytime your fill is active, we monitor to see if the dryer is full. And if we see that the dryer is not full for a given period of time, labeled here as our grain flow, we have it set currently to 180 seconds or 3 minutes. If we don't detect grain at the top of the dryer for 3 minutes, we're going to assume that you've run out of corn. So a way for you to indicate to the machine that we're not out of corn, we're just filling up the first time of the day and it's going to take more than 3 minutes, we'll come over here, click Fill from Empty, and then we can hit our back button, come back to the control page, and start our grain fill. Once the dryer is completely full that first time and the rotary bin switch at the top of the dryer detects grain, that checkbox will automatically uncheck and you'll resume normal operation. If you don't check that box, you'll start filling for 3 minutes or however long the timer's set for, and then you'll enter a cool down mode because we'll assume that you've run out of corn. So now that we have grain filling, we're going to assume that the dryer has filled with corn, so our air pressure becomes satisfied, both on plenums 1 and 2. At this point, we can now start our burners. So again, if we focus on the burner button for plenum number 1, we see it says Start. The stop button says Stopped, telling us that our current state is not running. When we hit the Start button, the way these ignition boards work, there's a 7-second purge prior to trial for ignition. In order to make sure that the user knows what's going on, when we click Start, you'll see that it says Purging, and it flashes. This is to indicate to the user that you shouldn't expect to see a flame yet, but that there is a process going on in the background. Once the purge is finished and we detect a flame, you'll see running here. And once again, if we go to our overview page, we can see plenum number 1 has cold air coming in and hot air coming out because the burner's on. Plenum number 2 has cold air coming in and cold air coming out because the fan's on but not the burner. If we come back to our control and start plenum number 2, it'll purge, and we'll be able to see it's going through its purge right now. It hasn't turned on yet, but after a few seconds, this turns red, which indicates that the burner has ignited and we have a positive signal. Now that we have our dryer full of grain, we've got the fans running and the burners are both on, we're going to go ahead and start discharging corn. And you've started your dryer. You'll be running right now in manual mode. We'll get into the automatic modes of operation a little bit later. So a couple takeaways from this segment. You can start the dryer from your control page. All the buttons you need to start that dryer can be navigated to or found directly on that page. Before doing that, you should have already set any alarm settings or operational set points. Now, of course, you can change those while you're operating, but we recommend you take a look at those prior to starting. The buttons are going to communicate to you in several different ways through their color and through the text on the buttons, exactly what's going on at the current moment. You should make sure to use the Fill from Empty option to avoid a shutdown if your dryer was empty prior to starting your grain fill. And again, the note that your control page may not look identical to the one that we were looking at right there, but the process will be the same and all of the similar features will be on your dryer. So once you've run your dryer for several hours and you're ready to shut down, there's a couple different ways that the dryer could be turned off. It'll either be shut down by your decision to shut down the dryer, or due to a critical or cool down alarm. So we're going to go through each one of those scenarios and explain how the dryer is shut down in each case. So if there's no alarms, you're just done drying for the day and you'd like to shut down the dryer, we'll go through a manual shutdown. The way that we would recommend to do this is to first stop your discharge and your burners. A lot of people like to run their fans for a few minutes to cool off the corn. We don't recommend doing this for more than a few minutes. That first batch of corn that you have in there is going to be very dry when you start discharging the next day. But if you run the fan for just a couple minutes to get the inside of the machine cooled off a little bit, once you've got your plenum to a point you're happy with, we can go ahead and turn off our fans and we can stop our grain fill. I want to mention that both grain fill and discharge have timers associated with starting and stopping the equipment. So keep in mind that just because you've touched the stop button doesn't mean that all equipment will stop immediately. Some of it will be delayed on both the startup and the shutdown. So when you're stopping things manually, just be aware that hitting the stop button, there will be a delay that's based on what these timers are set to. That is adjustable by the user. If there's questions on that portion, there's a lot of information in our manual, or we can potentially get into it later in the question and answer. But I'm going to try to skip by that for now, just in the interest of time. So now that everything has been turned off, all motors are stopped, we can go ahead and turn off our control power, and the dryer's been shut down in what we would call a graceful way. So that handles our manual shutdown. But what about the event of an alarm or the machine having to shut down for some other reason? So let's imagine that our dryer was on and we had our fan running and our discharge running. Somebody on site sees something they don't like and they push in an e-stop. So an emergency stop is going to cause a critical shutdown alarm. If we hit one now, we see we get a red alarm screen, which indicates a critical shutdown. If we close this alarm, lost connection here. Push in the e-stop. Did you pull it out? Push it in. Did I get connection back? Here, we'll try that one more time. We lost our connection to the simulation. All right, if we push in the e-stop, there we go, we got our alarm. Okay, there we go. And we see everything was turned off. We cannot click our control power, it's dim, and we have a red alarm reset button in here indicating that we have an active critical alarm. So, couple notes here. Anytime that a critical alarm happens, we assume that a person is in danger. So that includes high limit alarms, that includes e-stops, anything that's part of the human safety circuit. For those alarms, everything cuts power immediately. So your grain fill and discharge will stop right away. Any applicable timers will not run, and fan and burners stop immediately. So this is the least graceful shutdown of the dryer, but it's deemed to be an emergency, so we essentially pull the plug and turn everything off. There's another type of alarm called a cool down alarm. If you can pull the e-stop back out. Okay, so we've reset our e-stop and cleared the alarm by clicking on the alarm reset button. If I now turn on my control power, in this instance I'm going to start my fan. Can we get air pressure? And I'll start a burner as well. So we've satisfied air pressure. I'll turn on burner number 1. And let's go ahead and start our discharge. So we'll wait for this to finish purging. Okay, so in this example we've got our first plenum running, fan and burner. Our discharge is running. And then we'll trigger any of a number of cool down alarms. For this example, we'll go ahead and trigger a takeaway fault. So we see an orange cool down screen. It's labeled as a cool down alarm. You'll get your name, type, and description of the alarm here. If we close that window, a couple of things to note. First thing we see is that the alarm reset button has turned into a cool down timer. If we look at what's still active, we can see we haven't lost control power yet, but the discharge that was running turned off, the burner that was running turned off, but the fan is still running. So when you enter a cool down mode, the way that we're going to handle that is everything besides the fans is turned off, and the fans will continue to run until the cool down timer gets down to 0, at which point the fan as well as the control power will disengage. The reason for this is the alarm that came up, we've deemed it as necessary to shut down the dryer. There's many times this could happen. Let's say your discharge is overflowing, or you've run out of corn, perhaps you've run out of gas on site. All of these are scenarios where we want to stop the dryer, but we don't necessarily need to shut everything off immediately. So we can go ahead and leave our fans running and try to shut down in a more graceful way. One note is that your grain fill and discharge will shut down with any associated timers during this type of shutdown in most scenarios. In this specific scenario, where we had a takeaway overflow, the discharge would stop immediately. The grain fill would continue to follow any timers. So we try to shut it down in the softest way we can, and then once the timer finishes, we would shut everything else off. Now, if you're on site when you have a shutdown like this, if you come up to the screen and you see that you're in the middle of a cool down and your fan's still running, you may know what the problem was and be able to address it and try to get the dryer running prior to the dryer shutting down. So what you can do, you can click on the timer up here, and you'll get a screen asking you, would you like to exit cool down mode? If you click no, nothing happens, the timer continues going down, and when it hits 0, everything will shut off. But if I click on this button and I say, yes, I would like to exit cool down mode, I get a pop-up that indicates to me that I've stopped cool down mode, and we'll notice the timer's gone. So what we've done now, the fan is still running, and it will do so indefinitely until you turn it off. By exiting cool down mode, you've essentially told the dryer that you don't need to shut down. Somebody's on site that's going to handle it from here. The main benefit of this type of feature is if you have multiple fans running, or if you have a very large tower dryer, let's say you have a 150 horse fan running, we really want to avoid turning that fan on and off any more than we have to. So if some alarm happens that we don't want to continue running, but you have somebody on site that can address the problem and get back up without having to restart the fan, that's a big benefit. But I do want to make sure we stress that exiting cool down mode puts you into manual with your fans running. Or any fans that were running will remain running. So if you exit cool down mode and leave the site, your fan's going to continue running until somebody comes back and turns it off. Just be aware of that. So a couple takeaways from this segment. There's three different types of alarms. Warning alarms are yellow and will not shut you down. Cool down alarms are orange and are a delayed shutdown. And critical alarms are red and they'll shut down everything immediately. The cool down can be canceled if desired. And one thing I forgot to mention is that the timer is adjustable. So if we jump back here, we can see from our control screen, I have fan settings down below. If I click on fan settings, there's my cool down timer. The actual setting is a read value over here. I can't change that, but I can change the set point right here of 300 seconds. I can go anywhere between 0 and 500 seconds. So the fourth topic that we want to get into just briefly here is troubleshooting and diagnostics. We're going to look at a few basic troubleshooting tips, but mainly what we want to do is introduce to you the new features that have been added to the software that will help you in the troubleshooting process. So on the far left side here is our safety circuit screen. That's where you can see any components that are associated with the human safety circuit. Losing any one of these components on this screen will cause a critical shutdown and will prevent you from latching your control power. So let's run through a few simulations of how we can use that screen to identify a problem. If we go, there's a couple ways to get to this. We can go to troubleshooting. We have our safety circuit button right here. Alternately, we can be on our control page. And if let's say we come to the dryer and it's off and Mike will go ahead and trip an alarm. we can do, we'll throw a high limit or something. Or E-stop's fine, sure. So we went ahead and threw an E-stop, and we can see from the control screen that we cannot latch control power, and we can see that because the buttons aren't illuminated. We'll also notice in this event there's no active alarms because perhaps somebody came over and acknowledged the alarm already, but they never actually fixed the problem. So this is a scenario that can happen and sometimes can be hard to identify. If you come into a situation like this, we see that the safety circuit button is illuminating red. If we click there, it brings us to this page. And we can at a glance see that everything's illuminated except for the E-stops. So if we circle around the dryer and we find the E-stop that's pressed in and pull it out, we'll see that we now have the control power illuminated, and either directly from this page we could latch control power or from the control page. Notice when the control power is off, our safety relay OK button is not illuminated. Once we turn on control power, we get a green indicator that the safety relay has been latched. So we're going to go through another example here. If we were to trip something on this row, notice that all of these are wired in series. So if we were to lose high limit number 1, we'll see an alarm that says plenum high limit number 1. And you'll notice that all 4 of these lights went out. So when you come to this page, you don't need to check all 4 of these things immediately. You always want to start from the top and work your way down. So these rungs are separate, but these guys are all tied to the same series. So I see that my motor overloads are responding with a positive signal, but my first high limit switch isn't. So if we go ahead and we look at the high limit and we see that it has in fact been tripped, so we push the reset button on the high limit switch, and we'll see that everything else below it lights up, and we can then start our control power. If there were multiple problems on the same rung, you would just work your way down. As you fix each problem, it should move, the lights should move down to the bottom. One thing I want to mention is keep in mind, I think this is an area where it's a big improvement over previous years. To do this type of troubleshooting in the past, you used to require a voltmeter and running through the safety circuit sheet. So this is one of those ways that we've really been able to bring a little more information to the screen and hopefully get a problem fixed a lot faster. Another area where we can get some troubleshooting help or just general information is going to be the dryer components page in the troubleshooting menu. So on my top bar up here, if I hit the home button and I navigate to the troubleshooting tab on the bottom, there's a page called dryer components. If I come here, I'll see several different key components listed on this page. And this page updates to only include components that are installed on the dryer that you're working on. So clicking on any one of these buttons will open a full page description with a picture of the component, as well as information about how to set it, how it might trip, and other helpful information. What we've essentially done is taken information directly from the manual and brought it into the software so that when you're having trouble with a high limit alarm, you might be able to come directly into here and learn more about what the high limit switch looks like so that it might help you find it on the machine. You'll notice on the bottom we also have buttons on the bottom of these pages to go directly to some pages that might help you. If you have a problem with a high limit switch, potentially there's a burner setting that has to change, or potentially you want to go to your PLC I/O modules. And on the topic of PLC I/O, this is the last portion I wanted to talk about with troubleshooting. We've updated our PLC I/O page. If you look at the bottom, we can see that there are 6 pages along the bottom, but I can only currently go to these 3. The 3 on the right are grayed out, and the reason for that is because they're not installed on this machine. So an L1000 won't be equipped with those last 3 modules because they're not necessary. So the 3 modules that are installed on my machine will be lit up and I can click on them. They're also going to be installed in this same orientation in the low voltage cabinet. So what we've done, when you look in the low voltage cabinet at the very top left of the cabinet, you'll see these exact 3 components installed in this order and orientation. And on the top left module, these are all the wires and inputs that are coming to that component, and they wire into the top side. So if you find yourself trying to chase wires and see where they might be installed, you can use these menus to see exactly which wires are coming in, which module they plug into, and where exactly they connect. On this page, there's a couple different color codes that we can look at. Anywhere that you see white text indicates something that's installed on the machine but does not currently have a signal coming back. When you see green text, that means that it's installed on the machine and you currently have a 24-volt signal coming back. And when you see this grayed out text, that means that that component isn't applicable to your machine and you don't need to worry about it for troubleshooting. We can see our digital inputs and outputs as well as any analog signals. And then again, as we go to the next module over, we can see all components installed on this machine and all of the extra pieces that could be plugged into this module but aren't needed for your current machine. Of course, there's a lot more that we could go into with diagnostics and troubleshooting, but this is at least explaining to you the tools that are available to you to help you in solving any problems that may arise. So, a couple takeaways from this section. We've tried to include information from the manual directly into the HMI. Make use of the visuals that we've put in there. We try to indicate to the user exactly what component we're talking about, what they look like. If there's anything that you're unsure of or you need clarification on how something should work, use the question marks that are placed throughout the button or throughout the software. And the components that you see on each screen will reflect the actual dryer that you're looking at. So if there's any piece that is not showing up that should be, perhaps we need to get in touch with a dealer and make sure that your dryer is properly configured. So the last topic we want to go into is the automatic modes of control, both AccuDry and TrueDry. So for those not familiar, TrueDry is a temperature-based control system. It runs off of a mid-grain temperature sensor, whereas AccuDry is a moisture-based control system. It utilizes moisture sensors on the top and bottom of the dryer in order to run the dryer automatically. If we look at our simulation, one of our three main pages is our monitor page. I'm going to go to this page, and there's a lot of information here. We can see up at the top there's display information on your current grain going into and leaving the dryer. We can see the current discharge speed as well as several applicable temperatures. We have graphs in the middle here that show the past 2 hours of trending. If you want more trending information, you can click this button to get more information going back 2, 4, 12, and 24 hours. At the bottom of the screen, there's a data logging portion. This is where you get the same information as the trending screens, just in number format in case you want to keep notes. And again, there's more data history located on another screen that you can find through the home screen or directly from the monitor page. You can toggle between moisture trending and mid-grain trending within this page by touching these two buttons. So that's just a few comments. One other area I want to draw your attention to is these three fields over on the right. You'll notice all three of these are set points. So we have set mid-grain, set discharge moisture, and set discharge speed. Only one of these will ever be active at a given time, and it'll depend on what your current mode of discharge is. So right now we're running in manual mode, which means we will control exactly what the discharge speed is, and the dryer will run at whatever our discharge speed rate is. For the sake of this, I'm going to go ahead and turn on our discharge so that we can see it running. Discharge should be started, or in the process of starting. Within a few seconds, this should update with a current running value, and we'll see that it's exactly equal to our set point. If I change this to 22.8, our speed will immediately change to reflect the input that we entered. So if we want to change to one of our automatic modes of operation, say TrueDry, we would click on the True Dry button, and a couple of things will happen. Notice that we can no longer change our discharge speed, and we just saw right here, it's actually changing on its own. It's changing based on this mid-grain set point. So the dryer is now going to control the speed to try to maintain this, this set point where this is the actual temperature. So right now, the mid-grain is too high. It's going to try to speed up the dryer to bring down that mid-grain temperature. If I were to want to enter AccuDry mode, you can't move directly between two automatic modes of operation. So if I want to go from True Dry into AccuDry, I would first jump back into manual mode, and we'll see that we'll go back to controlling the speed here, and I would click my AccuDry button. So AccuDry works a little differently than the other modes of operation in that clicking this button doesn't just automatically enter you into AccuDry. If I click this button, a pop-up will appear. That anyone who's run Pinnacle Lite will be pretty familiar with this pop-up, but for anyone who isn't, this gives you some information about the AccuDry system. It tells you what the current discharge speed is, as well as what the AccuDry board thinks the current discharge speed should be. And it tells you what the actual outgoing moisture is, as opposed to what they're currently predicting. So you can tell in our simulation here, where we've been changing the numbers in a way that doesn't exactly reflect reality, the board's having trouble predicting what the current output moisture should be. So we've put together a few slides to help with the different stages that you would expect to see under normal operation. So the far left screen indicates an AccuDry, a dryer that isn't ready to enter AccuDry. You can see that in a couple different ways. The most obvious is that the button's not illuminated and that the AccuDry Ready button globe is not green. If we look at the not ready reason here, we can see that in this case, the current reason we can't get into AccuDry is because we're not currently discharging corn. This will show any time that you can't get into AccuDry for any reason, it'll be displayed here. So if for some reason you're having trouble getting in, look for your not ready reason and start addressing those problems. You'll also need to make sure that you've run long enough and close enough to your desired set point that it's been able to suggest a value that's fairly close to what the current running speed is, and that its predicted moisture is fairly close to what the actual moisture is. It's important that even if AccuDry isn't ready, it should be learning anytime that you're running. So as long as you're not in an alarm condition or some other condition that's preventing AccuDry from learning new data, this globe should be illuminated green. So if your AccuDry system is currently learning, but you're not ready, that just means you need to be patient and wait a little longer while it prepares to enter AccuDry. And once the predicted and suggested values are close enough to the real values, this button will illuminate. We can see in this case we've gotten our system to a point where it's comfortable with its predictions. AccuDry Ready is now green, and the button says AccuDry Enable. Clicking that button will go through about a 10-second process while it jumps into AccuDry, and when that's finished, you'll have a green globe around it, and it'll say AccuDry. You're now running in AccuDry. When you're ready to leave AccuDry, you would come back and click on the manual button again to leave your AccuDry mode. So there's a lot more to get into there if we, the ins and outs of how AccuDry and TrueDry work, but at least we can see in our current system, how do you navigate between them? So a couple takeaways. Make sure that you're in manual mode if you're prior to going into TrueDry or AccuDry. If you're in one of the automatic modes and you try to go directly to another mode, you'll get a pop-up that'll prompt you to go to manual first. If your AccuDry isn't ready, consult the not ready reason and try to figure out exactly what's preventing the system from getting in. And be aware of your operational set points. Keep in mind that when you switch to TrueDry or AccuDry, it's going to start tracking a different set point. So if you're going into TrueDry, make sure that your mid-grain set point is set properly. And if you're going into AccuDry, make sure that your discharge moisture set point is set appropriately. that wraps up our prepared presentation. So at this point, we'd like to open up the floor to any questions that you may have. So you can feel free to unmute your phone if you have a question, and we can go through those either on the simulator or try to answer your question in the best way possible. So if anybody has any questions that came up throughout the presentation or just something separate that they've been wondering about, you can feel free to speak up.
This year, but we get to the point you might want a different max change.
Say that again.
Excuse me? So did anybody have any questions come up throughout the presentation? Anything that wasn't clear to them or something that they was hoping would be covered that we didn't touch on?
I got a question about, we end up drying some soybeans too, rather than just corn. Is there anything we need to change in the dryer, in the AccuDry, or anything in the general setup if we switch between crops?
Yes. So if we go back to our simulation here, I'm going to go to the home screen. And if I go to my system configuration, which is in the troubleshooting menu, there is a field here for your grain type. So this doesn't have a big impact on manual or true dry operation, but if you are running an AccuDry, there are saved settings within the AccuDry system that are applicable to each individual grain type. So it is important that if you're changing corn to soybeans or something different, that you indicate that to the system.
Okay.
Oh, we got dryer configuration. Probably gonna be one of the 3 bottom buttons. Yeah. Wonder if it's
Just show them the tabbing, the system settings, historical tab.
configurations. Oh, that's real. I just saw it.
So are there any other questions that came up throughout the presentation?
Any comments?
Or any general comments that anybody might have?
Question mark? Question mark? Yeah, it's not everything works because it's not hooked to a dryer. It's
Just leave it. We'll stay on the line for about 5 or 10 minutes if there are any questions, just to pop it up.
Sure. So what we'll do is we're going to stay on the line for another 5 or 10 minutes here at least. So if any questions do come up, feel free to chime in. Or again, if there's anything that you want to see on the software that we could try to show you through the simulation, we can do that as well. So feel free to speak up if you've got a concern. We'll be on the line for at least another 5 or 10 minutes here to see if you have questions.
Other than that, thank you.
This is what Jeff is recommending.
you know, a punchback. No, we can ask him. What do you hear? Right there. That's it. That is. It comes in a red box. Oh, okay. I'll show you. It's 24 by 16. That's the steering, dude.
Would you start the dryer running in manual mode and then put it into true?
Yeah, just to make sure I heard you correctly, you asked if we start the dryer in manual mode and then enter true dry?
Yeah, can you just do that process right now?
Sure. So let's see, where did we leave this? So if the dryer was off to begin with, and we start the dryer, we would want to make sure that any applicable fans and burners, as well as grain fill and discharge, are running. If we can get air pressure, Mike. And forgive me, we have to toggle some switches here to simulate air pressure and other things. So now that we have air pressure, we can start our burners. Before going into true dry, our recommendation is going to be to have the dryer running. There we go. If we want to verify, we can look here to see We actually never started our second burner, but we can see in this example we'll just have our one burner going. What you'd want to do is run in manual until your mid-grain temperature, until your output moisture is near where you want it to be coming out. So we recommend that you basically run in manual until the system is stable near where you want it, at which point you would change your mid-grain set point to be close to whatever your current mid-grain temperature is. Basically what we've now determined is that mid-grain temperature seems to get you the output moisture that you wanted. So now that we've verified that and we've changed our set mid-grain value here, we could then jump into true dry, and it'll be controlling in true dry. So it's entering true dry is it's a pretty straightforward process. The biggest part to entering true dry or AccuDry is to make sure that we get the dryer stable prior to trying to enter an automatic mode of operation. Was there anything specific that you wanted to see there besides just getting into true dry?
No, I just wanted to have a run through in case of any customers on the webinar here, just so they can see it as well.
Sure.
You guys might want to add, like when you start dryers, like on AccuDry systems, I believe that run for a half a day before switching over as well.
Sure. That's a very good comment. So the comment there was to make sure that when you have a new dryer with AccuDry, it will take a half a day or so, sometimes more, sometimes less, to get that board acclimated. They come out of the factory at a basically empty state. We have it set to just a standard dryer configuration. So that AccuDry board is going to learn your dryer, your drying conditions, your grain type. There's a lot of factors that affect the drying process. So it'll take a little while on that first startup for the AccuDry board to get acclimated. Subsequent startups will be much faster, but that first one can take a little while. So just be patient on day one. And the biggest thing there, the biggest clue I could give to especially new users who aren't familiar with AccuDry, make sure that your suggested and current speeds are close. This would not be close enough for me to want to get into AccuDry right now, even if it was allowing me to. And make sure that your predicted moisture is very close to what the actual moisture is. What that's telling you is the Dryer Master board is always trying to guess what the current grain coming out of the dryer should look like. And if its guess is not very close to what's actually happening, that's telling you that it's not ready to do automatic control yet, because what it's guessing isn't coming true. So it's in your own benefit to make sure that those suggested and predicted values are very close to what the current operating values are prior to trying to use AccuDry. And doing so will make sure that you have much better results, and that once you enter AccuDry, it's a much more stable experience.
Seemed like the last one we did, we waited actually 2 days before switching over to AccuDry, and it worked really good.
Okay. Yeah. The long story on that, and again, it was just mentioned that he waited 2 days on the last one, and that he had a lot of success once he jumped in. The more patient you can be, the better results you're going to have. And of course, we could tell people to wait a week and they'll be annoyed with us. So the longer that you can be patient, it's going to give you better results. But as soon as your predicted and suggested values are within a couple percent on the speed and within a couple tenths on the predicted moisture, you should be ready to get in there. But it does vary based on the model, how long it's going to take for that to become accurate.
Can you run in true dry for a couple days, then go to AccuDry?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So AccuDry will learn, the important thing there, if you're running in true dry, what you'll want to do is click on the AccuDry button, and this would be a good example of what you're talking about. Maybe on a couple hours into that first day, you found a good speed to run at in manual, and you set your mid-grain temperature and you want to run in true dry for a while. We'll see here, we're currently running in true dry. The AccuDry system isn't ready to go in yet, but it is learning. So while you're running in true dry, the AccuDry system will continue learning. And then once you see this AccuDry system become ready, you could go ahead and switch from true dry into AccuDry. Yeah, and keep in mind you will have to go into manual first, just before going. You'll have to jump into manual and then go into AccuDry mode. But that's a very good suggestion.
That's if you have AccuDry. I mean, or just
Exactly, and that should be noted too, that TrueDry and manual will be installed on every machine. AccuDry is an option, so not all machines will have AccuDry. If your machine is not equipped with AccuDry, this button will not be available. It'll look like the AccuDry Lite button here. One of the things, hey Mike, do you want to log into one of those and disable like an in-feed sensor? I want to show what some of these pages. So this was the page we were looking at earlier with our in-feed and discharge sensor information. If you bear with me for a second here, we've got Mike going in and he's going on the service side and he's going to remove AccuDry and the in-feed sensor. And we'll see what the screen would look like. If you go, I can do it from here too. Go into service. You'll have to do AccuDry, disable AccuDry first, and then disable the in-feed sensor. Okay, so what you'll see, I didn't change the page that I was on here, but it automatically updated so that when we went in and we removed the in-feed sensor, we can see that all of this information is now not available. And for dryers that only have a discharge, they'll have this portion of the screen showing to them. So part of the reason we do this is we want to make sure to show that this could be installed on the machine if it's desired. So these fields are placeholders in case anybody wants to put an in-feed sensor on there. And if we went and looked now, we can see that the AccuDry button is no longer white, it's gray. And we can also see that anything else that was associated with AccuDry or the in-feed sensor has changed to not available. So we showed you a fully equipped machine for this demo, but your machine may have some pieces that show not available depending on what's installed.
Would you be able to run through the fill and takeaway delay timers? I was just about
Sure.
to suggest that, yeah.
So we can look at that now. I'm actually going to go there. We've been navigating from the control screen because it is good to know that everything you want to do can be found directly from this page, but you can also get there from the home screen. So when you're going through on day one, I'm going to recommend just toggling through every page that you find in here and checking the settings, making sure that you're happy with them. You won't have to do that every time you start the dryer, but it is a good practice to do that, you know, at the beginning of each season and ensure that everything is still applicable. So you're asking about our grain fill delay timers. So this is something new that's been added this year, and it's going to be set up slightly differently on each customer's machine. We've made it very customizable. And so some of these pieces will not be used, some of them will be. But essentially what we have available to you is two separate signals on the fill and on the takeaway. The reason we did it this way is so that you can stage on and off any equipment that you have coming to or leaving the machine. So if you have some scenario with an air system that has to start prior to everything else, you can wire it up so that that system will begin early before grain enters the system. You can also have various pieces of equipment continue to run afterwards in order to empty them out. And all of this is customizable. If you just have a simple system with an auger in, auger out, you can set these values to 0. The only timer that I'm really going to recommend we always use is going to be the fill 1 start delay. In every scenario, you want to have a delay between your call for grain and when the motor starts. Otherwise, that motor is going to be toggling on and off very frequently. But in general, you can see here we have a fill 1 signal and a fill 2 signal. Those can be tied, both of those can be tied to customer equipment or only one of them. And you can use the chart down here to see what's going to turn on at any given time. So when the rotary bin switch on the top of the dryer starts turning and we get a positive call for grain, we're going to call that time 0 over here. During this chunk, which is 2 seconds long, so this time period will take place for 2 seconds, you have an active call for grain, and your grain fill number 2 signal, so that's this signal here, will start immediately. after 2 seconds has elapsed, your grain fill number 1 signal will come on. So now you have both signals running. That's during this time period here. Once the corn gets up to the rotary bin switch at the top of the dryer, your call for grain will go away. That's this line here. So now you're into this time period, now that the call for grain has gone away. For the next, in this case, only 2 seconds. We put these timers pretty short so that we could run through our starting and stopping quickly. In this case, for 2 seconds after you lose your call for grain, all of your equipment is going to continue to run, at which point fill number 1 signal will turn off, and fill number 2 will continue to run for an additional 5 seconds. So we don't expect you to memorize how this toggles on and off, but you have charts here that kind of help indicate what happens during each stage, and we have some descriptions here about what exactly each of these input fields does for each of these timers. So we're going to make a default assumption that most of these timers will be set to 0, but they are available to be used if you want to set up different delays on your starting and stopping of your equipment. A similar set of timers is available on the takeaway. So we can see here, I'm going to go ahead and stop the takeaway. So actually we can see when I stopped the takeaway, metering turned off right away, but for an additional time, the takeaway 1 and takeaway 2 signals continued running, and we saw that timer going down. So when we start the takeaway number 2 signal will turn on immediately. That's this one. 5 seconds later, your metering and your takeaway 1 signal will turn on. So if we were to start that, we see for 5 seconds, takeaway 2 is flashing, indicating that it's running. After the 5 seconds has elapsed, now all of your signals are running. So just because I'm on the screen and I'm looking at it, I should also mention that there have been jog buttons introduced. These buttons bypass the regular starting and stopping sequence. These are meant to be used either for testing or if you have a discharge jam. These work as dead man switches, so while you hold the button down, that component will run. If I hold takeaway 1, that component turns on, and when I let go, it stops. So this is meant for testing a motor or trying to unjam your takeaway in the event that something gets plugged up. I know that was a quick overview. I hope that helped clarify things. Are there I saw a question come through about moisture sensors, but before I jump to that one, is there any more questions on the fill and takeaway?
On the takeaway, where do you shut the metering rolls off?
So we've combined all takeaway equipment into one button, discharge. So when you start your discharge, that will start all takeaway equipment as well as metering. And so if you're trying to run just your takeaway equipment, you can do that through the jog buttons, or if you're doing something specific, you can increase your metering start delay up to 4 minutes, it looks like we can put into there. So if you're trying to do something specific or clean something out, you can increase your metering start delay here. But yeah, everything, metering rolls and beyond, is started from the discharge button here.
So if you're warming up the grain, it's just going to go ahead and start discharging if you start the discharge, right?
Yeah, you cut out in the middle there, but did you ask if you're warming up the dryer? When you start the discharge button, it will start metering rolls and everything. So when you're just trying to warm up the dryer, I would not recommend turning on your discharge yet.
Okay, because that's a lot of farmers turn that on immediately, previous dryers.
Sure. Yeah, and that is a change from last year, so I'm glad you brought it up, because we used to have, not looking right at it, we used to have a takeaway and a metering switch, and so we've combined that into a discharge mode that kind of encompasses everything and stages them on and off automatically. We do recommend for anybody who has a need to run extra equipment separate from our dryer, we do recommend that they install a separate switch if that's a need that you're going to have. We try to make sure with our software that we're focusing on the dryer operation.
So when your initial startup, you should start keep the discharge speed at a low speed until you kind of figure out where you're at.
That's not a bad idea. You're saying on day one to start that discharge speed slow, at least until you can figure out that everything's turning on as intended. And do make use of those jog buttons to make sure when you hit one of those jog buttons, you'll be able to see exactly what equipment is tied to that signal. So it's a good way to verify if you've plugged in the equipment to the right customer input. You can go ahead and push jog number 1 or jog number 2, and you should hear that equipment click on immediately. So that'll help you out in determining if you've wired it up correctly. And keep in mind that after day 1, once these settings are put in there, they really don't need to change very often. So this is an installation type situation that we're talking about. And once these are all set up, it's not very common for the customer to switch their takeaway setup.
You have a chart on here that, like a starting point, so if it's 24% moisture, kind of just a quick reference guide. So then it'll tell you that your mid-range should be pretty close to like 140, 150, whatever.
Yeah.
And your discharge should be like 22%.
Yeah, we have very similar charts to what we had in the Pinnacle Light. Is it the operations?
No, the operations manual.
Sorry, the operations manual. That will have charts like you're talking about. Given a certain in-feed moisture, it'll predict a plenum temperature and a discharge speed.
Kind of a set point. Because all of a sudden you start out, like the last guy said, leave your discharge slow, all of a sudden it's too slow, it's
right.
Corn up too much, and
sure. I believe what he meant was to start with it slow just for the first minute or two until you can verify that everything's moving properly. Once you verify that all of your augers are turning properly and corn's coming out where it's supposed to, then I would move to the recommended speed that we've got in our operations manual. And those are just suggestions. They should get you in the right ballpark, though. One comment just talking about those discharge speeds is that a change from last year, the minimum discharge speed is 10%. So you may see something running at 10% and you're going to try to go down to 5%. You cannot enter a value lower than 10%. And the reason that we did that is because it's always worked that way. It just wasn't clear to the user that it was working that way. We had a minimum speed on the VFD set at 5 hertz out of 60. And so if you entered 0% discharge, it was still running at 5 hertz. What we've done is we've rescaled that and put a minimum of 10% so that it's more genuine to the user exactly how to change speeds at those low ranges. The reason that's important, if you were to change from, say, 1% to 2%, you might think you've doubled the speed, but you've really gone from 5 hertz to 5.5 hertz or something similar. Now, if you go from 10% to 20%, you have actually doubled your discharge speed.
Yeah, so it's actually it's scaled 0 to 60. We just don't allow you to go under 6 hertz.
Sure.
Which is 10%.
Yeah.
And then it's an easy calculation from there. So if you're running 50%, you're going to be running at 30 hertz.
Yep.
Auger is on a VFD now.
The what?
Takeaway auger is on a VFD.
Oh, okay. Another comment is that the takeaway auger is now run by a VFD. That used to be run by direct start. So on profile dryers, that auger speed will adjust with your discharge speed. And one note there is that one is limited at a minimum of 50% speed. So if you look at the speed on it, it'll be 30 hertz out of 60. If you're running anything between 10 and 50%, it'll be running at 30 hertz. And then as you increase above 50%, it'll start to speed up alongside the metering rolls. And that was done to have it run at a little bit lower speed so that it's not at max all the time. There was a question to go through a moisture calibration. I can show the screen. This is one of those things that isn't going to, I'm not going to be able to show you very well on the simulation because we don't have sensors installed. But what I can show you is what the screen looks like. This one is set up as a true dry machine. So in this case, what you would do is you'd get a sample of corn, you'd measure the moisture, and come over to the screen. You click on this white box here, You'll enter, let's say the sample that you took was coming out at 14.6%. You'd enter 14.6 and click calibrate. As far as true dry goes, that's the extent of the calibration. The AccuDry calibration process, it follows a similar path. I'll see, here, can we we'll go ahead and enable AccuDry. It may or may not let us go all the way through the process without sensors installed, but we can try it here. So you'll notice it looks similar. So the difference with AccuDry is you don't just go grab corn and then enter the value. You have to hit the start calibration button. So when I hit start, the sensor will begin reading for 25 or 30 seconds. During that time, or very closely before or after, you should go grab corn out of the sampler. We're going to have to wait for this to go through its process here. And then when it finishes taking its reading, so it'll know exactly what it thinks the moisture of that corn going through the dryer was. You'll take that sample and go get a measurement. In a few seconds here, this should be done. All right, so now it's ready for me to enter a value. I'll go ahead and put in whatever my lab measured value was, hit enter, and then confirm the calibration. And we can see it's now ready for a new calibration again. So that should work in a similar way to the past several years. Just a note that the maximum that this can change on one calibration is going to be 0.5%. So if your sensor is reading off by several percent, you're going to have to do several calibrations. The reason we've done that is, one, to avoid an issue where somebody accidentally forgets to put in a digit and all of a sudden they're off by 10% or something like that. And the other reason is, in general, if your sensor's reading off by more than 1% or so, we want you to take multiple readings because it's uncommon for it to be off by such a large margin. There's more information on exactly how this process works, again, in the help menu that's tied to the calibration. And there's more information as well in our, is it the controls manual? Are there any other questions or comments, or even just a screen that you were looking to see?
Well, we still have a handful of people on the line and viewing the webinar on our screen, so I just want to make a couple kind of closing announcements here. Just so everyone is aware and you can spread the word, we're going to have a playback of this webinar available for viewing and listening. Later on down the road, we'll probably get it posted here in the next day or two. We're also streaming it on Facebook Live, so if you're connected to Facebook, be sure to jump on there. You can check it out there. Be sure to like us and comment on it. We've been trying to get more engaging content to our dealers and our end users about the operation of our dryers, especially as we get closer to the harvest. So be sure to be looking out for some tech tips that are going to be coming out. It's a on-demand type video service, somewhat like we did last year, but this is going to be more spontaneous in terms of responding to the most commonly asked questions or the topic of the week based on the calls that we're getting here at the factory. So be looking for information on that. We're going to be rolling those out the first week of September. I want to thank everyone that was able to join us. There were a lot of end users on the call. There were a lot of dealers. I also want to thank everyone here at Mathews that helped make this happen, between Mike Wilkie and Eric and Nick. They've all been very busy with the production of our dryers in full swing, as well as wrapping up the software for Pinnacle 2020, and obviously putting together something like this just doesn't happen on its own, so thank you guys for that. I just want to say good luck to everyone with the harvest this fall. We've developed what we think is the best control system out there, and we hope you guys feel the same way too. We're really excited about the ease of use that this is going to bring to our end users, and the overall quality of the product that we're delivering to our customers, and the quality of the grain that you're going to get out of it as a result. So thank you, everyone. We're going to continue to stick on the line just in case there's any other questions or comments, so feel free. We just wanted to make those announcements before everybody leaves.
Okay, so as Joe mentioned, we will continue on the line here for a couple more minutes, so if there's any last-minute questions, feel free to ask them. If there's no more questions, then we'll go ahead and wrap up.